Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Q&A about business, innovation, and managing life. So I always learn things from questions people ask and my attempts to answer them. I see there are a number that are saved up here. Let's see. Deco, or however that's pronounced, asks, what is the value system you follow based on? Have you designed your own value and motivational structure? It's an interesting question. You know, what's important to different people is usually different. I mean, some people, for me, how would I characterize my value system? I like to do things well. I like to do things that where I can feel good about what I did. And I would say that's much more important to me than sort of other people's response to what I did. Other people have a different attitude towards that. But for me, I'm sort of customer number one, so to speak. You know, I care about how I feel about what I do. And I think that what does it mean to me to do things well? Often it means that I really fundamentally understand what is going on, whether that's a matter of, when I'm doing science, things like that, when I'm doing technology, did I really nail it? Did I get the essence of what was going on? Did I get that right? And do I feel like I've built something on solid ground, or am I just, able to make some little balloon that's floating up there, but there's no solid foundation. For me, the presence of that solid foundation is very important. Then I kind of know that I have something. If I have if the thing that I'm building may be very wonderful, but it sort of doesn't have a foundation, I'm never very sure that it's on solid ground. And that's true both in science and in technology kinds of things. I suppose for me, another part of my value system would be, are the things that I'm building things that somehow I'm making a unique contribution by building? And, I kind of, I sometimes said that I like building alien artifacts, things that people, once you see them, you realize, okay, that's a thing that could exist, but it wasn't something that was sort of about to get built by other people. I think a lot of things I've built, whether it's Wolfram Alpha or a new kind of science or our physics project, all these kinds of things are things which once built, people can say, oh, that's interesting. As I say, I'm kind of customer number one. Do I think it's interesting? That's the thing that's most important to me. I think that this kind of, if I feel like the thing I might be building is something where, oh, there's going to be 10 other people building the same thing. For me personally, it's like that's a very unmotivating thing. That's a thing where it's I'm not really so excited about doing it myself. If I feel like the thing that motivates me is to feel like I'm doing something unique that wouldn't happen if I wasn't doing it. Now, one of the things that's always a trade-off, there are usually, when you pick things to do, and it's true whether you're doing basic research or you're doing technology development or whatever else, you can do a thing where everybody knows it's important, or you can do a thing where nobody knows it's important. If you do a thing where everybody knows it's important, if you do it well, maybe you are at the head of the pack or somewhere near the front of the pack, but everybody knows what it is. And people say, oh, yes, you're building a such and such. And people say, oh, yeah, such and such is big. I'm building another, cryptocurrency. I'm building a this or that. There's a name for it. There's a thing. People know kind of what it is. And then you have to say, well, am I going to build a good one or a good enough one or one that's out at the front of the pack? And there's sort of a competitive aspect to it. Sometimes it's sort of a zero-sum thing. Sometimes it isn't. But you're trying to fight through the competitors, but at least people know what it is that you have. That's scenario number one. Scenario number two is you build something where people say, what the heck is that? I've never seen one of those before. We never thought about a full-scale computational language. We never thought about a computational knowledge engine. We never thought about a new kind of science. These kinds of things. They're things where it's like that wasn't a thing in the world. And for me, those are the ones I particularly like to build. But the challenge there is then you have to kind of, if you want people to pay attention to it, then you have to, then it's up to you to kind of explain, package it, present it in such a way that people can understand what the point is. And there is a certain tendency for people to say, like when Wolfram Alpha came out, Wolfram Alpha is not a search engine. It doesn't search anything. It's a computational knowledge engine. It computes answers to things. But yet people said, oh, it's a search engine. Well, it's not really a search engine, but that's kind of the closest heard kind of thing to the thing that we had built. And sometimes you kind of have to fight that off. And there's a certain feeling, I mean, many things I've done, I think, some of the more elementary things I've done, many decades later, people are like, oh, wow, this is amazingly cool. And, I'm like, okay, if that took, 2 or 3 decades, the things that I built that are much more intellectually sophisticated, it's like we're looking 50, 100 years for it to be sort of really absorbed what's going on. And I think that's something that it's a bit frustrating because it would be nice to kind of see the effect sooner. Although the fact is that with a lot of like technology and science, it's kind of an interesting thing because the people who do select in to be the people who understand the artifacts from the future now are a really wonderful set. And from some point of view, maybe I'm happier, maybe, I don't know, that about a very interesting group of people that's a smaller group than the full herd, so to speak, that will eventually come. But, the selection of people who are there now, it's a great group of people. And I'm really pleased that they're people who we have a chance to interact with and so on. So, again, it's a sort of multiply-edged sword there about when things get adopted. I think the thing that in my life has been perhaps a good thing is I know people who've done the great thing they were going to do when they were 25 years old. I was lucky enough to do some things that, got some visibility when I was that age and younger and so on. And that's nice. And that's a good confidence builder. But the truth is, the thing that is I have seen be kind of a killer is somebody does something that's really, really cool when they're 25 and they're kind of staring down the rest of their life and they're realizing, I'm never going to do something as cool as that again. And that's sort of a bad situation in many ways. I think the right thing to do for somebody in that situation is change what you're doing and, do something different and don't. And one of the things that I have been quite happy with in what I've done is, I never really take the point of view, the next project I do has to be bigger, stronger, harder than the last project I did. I just do projects that I think are interesting and I don't really assess, which one, like I just posted something today about multi-computational theory of games and puzzles. It's kind of a detail. It was interesting to look at. It was something where I was curious about it. I put some time into it. I answered the questions I wanted to answer. It's a building block for other things that I'll think about. I don't think it's one of my sort of peak, sort of all-time top hits type thing, but it's something that I found interesting and it will turn out to be a building block for other kinds of things. But I could take the point of view, I shouldn't do that project because it's not as important as the physics project or the things I'm doing in kind of multi-computation in general and things like this. But the thing that I found is it's worth doing a portfolio of projects. You don't know how it's going to come out. And if the project is interesting to you, my attitude is just do it and don't be thinking about, is that going to be the coolest project I've ever done? As I say, for me, I'm really customer number one, and it's kind of, what matters is whether I find it interesting, so to speak, rather than whether it has the longest possible sort of shadow in the world. Now, I think that this question about the value system and how one sets that up. I mean, for me, it's I have a very pragmatic attitude towards a lot of what I do, which is the worldly kinds of things I do, like running a company, making money, things like this. In terms of running a company, I care about what we make. I care about the people who work at the company, the customers we have. I don't think that the process of running a company is something that I do because it's a practical thing I need to do. It's not something where if I were to kind of, what do I find? I mean, if it was, it's not something where that is the thing that I want to do as a thing in and of itself, so to speak. And I think that that's, and similarly, when it comes to making money, for example, it's kind of like I want to make enough money that I can do the things that I want to do. And I've been fortunate enough to largely be able to do that, although it never, there are things where I would like to do more and that takes more money. And so one has to make more money, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it's something where for me, that's if the choice is do something interesting or do something that makes more money, I'm basically always going to pick to do something that's more interesting. Other people have a different point of view. I mean, sometimes people have this sort of multi-level point of view. You have to do something, and that's true for me as well. You have to do things that make money in order that you can do things that are more interesting to you. And if one is lucky, one is at the point where one can do things that make money and are interesting to one. And I've largely been able to do that. I think another piece of the sort of value system is I like to feel good about the stuff I've done, whether that's a project I've done where I think it's cool and I like what I produced in the project, whether it's a business thing that I set up, some deal or something where I feel like everybody came out ahead. I like that. Whether it's something that I've done working with employees, where it's like, well, I managed to get this person to really have a fulfilling and achieve what they could achieve. That's satisfying to me. I mean, I kind of, there are people where it's like, can I get ahead, even if there's something that I'm doing that I'm kind of not, it's a little bit squiggly, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. For whatever reason, I don't like that at all. I prefer to do things where I can feel really good, like I did something where, I acted with integrity and I did the right thing, even if that didn't necessarily give me the best personal advantage, so to speak. I mean, I suppose it's, different people are built differently in this regard. For me, I get a sort of satisfaction out of feeling that I did the right thing. Perhaps it's that's an important piece of it. In terms of motivation, in like, how do I decide I want to do the next thing and I'm motivated and I have to be interested in what I'm doing. I have to feel like it has to somehow tickle my interest. And obviously there's no right answer to what tickles one's interest. It's a very personal and specific thing. It's something where, as I have done different kinds of things, I've gotten interested in different kinds of things. And there are places where there are things that I was completely not interested in a few decades ago. And now it's like, I really find that very interesting. Example, educational kinds of things. When I was a professor back a long time ago, I really wasn't interested in education. And that was, and as a professor, I was at research universities and so on. And it's like, you can kind of get away with not really doing much teaching or anything like that. And I did, because I really wasn't interested in that. Fast forward a few decades, and I really find teaching quite interesting. I wouldn't want to do it all the time, but as a kind of a hobby activity, it's great. It's very invigorating to me, and I learn a lot from it. And that's why I do these live streams and things like that. And that's something where the motivation structure for me has changed over time. And kind of as I've learned more, and it's true in other areas as well, as I've learned more, I care about doing different kinds of things. I mean, there are things where sometimes I'll do things and I'll say, you know what, I just don't care about this. And I'm not going to do more of it. I mean, an example of that is certain kinds of sort of quotes, popular science, traditional media, be on television, things like this kinds of things. I've done that, didn't really do much for me. I wasn't that excited about it. It's like, okay, I don't really need to do that. It's fine. It's for other people, so to speak. There are things where I find it useful to sort of probe various kinds of things. Do I want to do this? At times in the distant past, it's like, do I want to do projects that are primarily to make money? where I decided I really didn't like that very much. It was not, it needs to be a project that is actually interesting to me. That's necessary for my motivation. It isn't enough to just be motivated by, make money from it or whatever else. And there are things where, whether it's go to some event in person, do some keynote thing somewhere, do this, do that. Which things do I care about? Which do I not? I try and pay attention to that. And, when I always am quite diligent about writing trip reports from events that I went to and things like this. And I will go through and I usually write, I try to write them as quickly as I can after the event, because I find that my degradation time of forgetting things is pretty rapid. Within a day, I will have forgotten some details of what, the interesting thing I learned from this or that person. If I write it down, then that's a good thing. And quite often I'll go back and I'll say, oh, there's this other, there's this event that's coming back. Maybe it happened before the pandemic now, and it's coming back again. What happened the last time I was at this? Oh, and by the way, what was the follow-up from all the things that happened at that event? And was there enough follow-up? And am I motivated to, to go back and do this again? So, those are some kinds of things that I try to do to sort of measure the, things where I said, this is a great, I really want to do this. This is cool. Then I do it. And it's like, I don't know. This didn't really float my boat in the way that I thought it was going to. And, over time, I've gradually tried to adapt to what do I find exciting? What don't I find exciting? And feed that back into my motivations. And, but I found that I do recognize that these things do change over time. There are things that I wasn't interested in the past. There are things that I was interested in the past that I'm not so interested in anymore, and so on. And there are things often for me, like here's an example. Like I, will read various magazines or technical journals, whatever else. When I'm actively interested in such and such a field, I'll be like, oh, I'm really interested. I'm going to devour these things. But I'm not really that interested in the field. It's like, well, I could look at them, but I'm just not. I don't really care. They don't. They kind of just flow in and out, and I don't. I don't pay attention to them. Let's see. Question from Universe Within. Do you find exercising your personal thoughts on these live streams can be a therapeutic experience? Yes, I think so. I don't know what quite therapeutic means, but yes, I find it interesting to try and explain myself. It is useful to me to try to explain myself. I find that, and honestly, when, in other settings where I have opportunities to do that, even within our own company, for example, when it's like, let me explain why we're doing this. I'll have some discussion with one of our senior management people, and it'll be like, I'm going to tell you about this thing. I'm going to tell you why we're doing it and why I think this way about this thing. That's very useful to me. And sometimes, I think it helps one, at least for me, it helps to kind of crystallize my thoughts about things, to be able to express them. And, sometimes for people, it's kind of a hump. You ask somebody, why are you doing this? And they're not really used to explaining themselves. And they're like, I don't know, I don't know. Well, it's worth getting over that hump. It's worth getting to the point where you can explain things. I've been doing enough of explaining of myself for enough years that, I'm somewhat fluent. I don't know, you guys can judge for yourselves at explaining myself. But, I don't think I started that way. And particularly when it came to sort of, I would say, my personal motivations and things about me and my feelings about things, I have to say that maybe it was growing up in England and so on. I don't think I was great at being the kind of most expressive of my feelings about this or that thing when I was younger. And that was a gradually sort of a learnt trait. And I think that that's something that, and for example, even the being able to explain why I think what I'm doing is great, so to speak. I think that trait was something that I kind of learnt kind of probably after I first had started running companies, because it was a trait that was pragmatically necessary in that activity. And then I realized, well, it's okay, I can do it. It's not as scary as I thought it was. But I think this process of trying to explain oneself is very useful. I mean, I think, you talk to, I don't know, kids and you say, how do you interact with your parents? So they say, oh, parents are always telling me I just should do this or that. And they say, do you ask them why? Say, well, they couldn't explain it. They can't explain that. And I think many people have that situation that they're just not used to explaining themselves. And so in many situations, they're in the, and the same is true with management of, you can just order somebody to do something. That's a very, in my mind and in my style of doing things, that's a pretty ineffective management technique. It is the kind of last resort management technique. Sometimes people are like, you can just say, can you do this? You don't really need to explain why. Although the more context a person has, the higher the probability that they'll be able to do it correctly, and that if there's some bump in the road, so to speak, that they'll be able to respond correctly to that. But I think that the thing that, for me, being able to explain myself is an important trait in management, because it's like, well, why are we doing this? Well, I can, I think I can usually explain it. And sometimes I will say, I guess I'm confident enough sometimes to just say, look, I don't really know. I think this is a good idea. That's my gut feeling. And, and I can give you 3 other examples of where similar things have happened, but I don't really know. But I think being able to be sort of open about the explanation process is, at least in my style of management, an important thing. Let's see. Robin is asking, have you ever thought about the role of physical exercise or sports as a companion activity to intellectual pursuits? Exercise has been shown to be the only big booster of neuroplasticity besides being of a developmental age. It's interesting that campuses have so much of it. I know. Depends on how big your campus is, so to speak. When I was about 40 years old, no, a little bit, no, younger than that. I think I finally, when I was a kid, I always avoided sports and those kinds of things. I was, I considered myself terrible at it. I didn't like it. I thought it was boring. It was, I was terrible. And, I went to, well, I have to admit that when I was in elementary school, I was one of those kids who would always say, I have a cold in the winter, and in the summer I would have hay fever. And somehow between those two things, I could always be, oh no, okay, fine. I think it's I somehow managed to avoid basically ever doing any sports whatsoever. And I think for and then later on, I avoided in high school as well. I went to a fancy high school called Eton in England. That is one of these schools that was founded before Columbus came to America type thing, and it's developed some of its own kind of unique games and things, none of which I ever played. I had friends who played them. My all-time favorite of crazy games is this thing called the wall game, played against this one particular wall that consisted of these 2 sort of teams that seemed to always be covered in mud, trying to get a ball from one end from the middle to one of the ends. At least when I was there, which is in the 1970s, it was the last time a goal had been scored in this game was in 1913 or something. And sadly, the person who had scored that goal was still commemorated, partly because they died in World War I, having scored this goal. But the fact that it had gone a solid 60 years without a goal ever being scored in this game kind of told me something about sort of the old world and the way that worked. But the one, cricket was one of the games that I'm telling silly stories here, but cricket is a game where I suppose I'm explaining how pathetically negative I was about sports kinds of things, because a few times I was kind of persuaded to go out and participate in some cricket type thing. And, my main study was cricket. I had the theory that in order to keep it from being just the most utterly boring possible game, every some number of balls, everybody goes, sort of rotates and changes or swaps their positions on the field. And, it was my big sort of thing to figure out where would the reflection invariant position on the field be, so I could just hang out there and not pay attention to anything. I do remember, though, that I have to tell one story, which was that when you play cricket, you're basically throwing this sort of woodenish ball down a pitch, and somebody has a bat and they have to hit the ball. That's the basic theory of it. More details I don't necessarily know in precisely, but in any case, people tend to like throw balls over their shoulders, and it's hard to aim a ball if you do that. But you can just roll the thing along the ground, and it's a lot easier to line it up and roll it along the ground. So at some time when one of the few times I played this game, it's I did that, and I managed to get I was able to like aim well enough to get the person who was batting out, and they were all upset. And it's like, oh, you can't do that. You can't roll the ball down the field like that. It would sound better if I were to imitate the kind of British accent this person had. But I was like, look, it's not against the rules. No, it's not against the rules. But they said, but it's not cricket. Okay, that's one of those expressions, right? But it's not cricket. And it was just fun for me to hear that expression just once in its sort of true context, so to speak. But anyway, so that's the preamble to a very negative view of sort of sports and games and so on. And I just was not into them. Sometime in my 30s, I kind of started saying, well, at least take a walk or something each day. I started doing that for a short amount of time, or it was sort of a run, but it wasn't really a run. And then sometime around age of 40-ish, I decided, look, I think my wife had been telling me this for years, but that's different. She's often told me things that she will claim I've ignored for many, many years, and she's right. And eventually they turn out to be correct. But this, taking exercise is a good thing. And so I started doing that. And, at this point, I like last 3 years, there hasn't been a single day when I've walked less than 10,000 steps. And like today, 14,000, 900. What I've done, the important compromise for me is that there isn't a compromise. That is, I have a treadmill, so if the weather my typical operating temperatures are between 40 degrees Fahrenheit and 80 degrees Fahrenheit. If it's between those temperatures and it's not raining hard outside, I'll walk outside. Otherwise, I'll walk inside. But the whole point is that I'm always working while I'm walking. If it's sort of inside, I have a computer on my treadmill, and I can just type and do things at my normal way of doing them. If it's outside, I do have a setup for typing on my computer outside, although it's not super convenient. And but more likely, I do calls where I can just look at a screen, and I'm doing a call where I'm in some meeting. Like today, I did several meetings where I was just walking around and watching the screen and participating in some discussion and so on. And I do that for a couple of hours a day, and I think that's been really good. I feel like I'm in better shape than I was when I was. I think my all-time trough of being in shape was around when I was about 40, when I just finished this decade-long project of writing this big book, New Kind of Science, and I was in terrible shape. But I think I've been in. I'm reasonably fit. As a result of basically, walking every day and so on. And yes, I think that's had an effect. I think, I make sure to sleep properly, and, I try to eat sensibly, and I take that exercise, and that's been a good thing for me. I found that it works better when I can walk outside than when I'm just sort of on the treadmill. I haven't quite figured out what is that signal to us humans that makes it better outside. Is it the way one's walking? Is it the kind of fresh air? Is it the, is it something else? I don't know. And if it is one of those things that's kind of down at the reptilian level, so to speak, it's not something that involves, a very sophisticated kind of thought process. Can I emulate it for my treadmill? Whether it's, fresh air, okay, I could probably arrange for more of that, or whether it's something about the visual environment or something like this. I haven't really figured that out. But yes, I think that the thing that yeah, I mean, at least for myself, and I've certainly encouraged other people in this regard. In a sense, I consider myself a little bit lucky that I was so pathetic at taking exercise and doing sporting kinds of things when I was younger, and maybe that means that it takes less for me to have an effect, so to speak, on myself by doing a bit of that when I'm older. I certainly, I remember a friend of mine who was a kind of gymnastics champion in his youth, and then he kind of stopped doing that, and it was kind of like then everything went to hell, so to speak. And so I'm sort of the opposite, having been absolutely pathetic at that when I was younger. I mean, I have to say, it's funny, I literally just today posted this piece about kind of the science of games and puzzles. And I have to say that as a person, as a player of games and puzzles, I don't like them at all. This analysis is of interest because it relates to things we're doing in our physics project, and it's kind of the global analysis. It's not like I'm going to play a particular tic-tac-toe game. It's the global analysis of all possible tic-tac-toe games. And that's something that I happen to find more sort of foundationally interesting. But I have to say, I'm an example of somebody who's just absolutely terrible at these sort of games, sports, puzzles, these kinds of things, because I'm always feeling like, look, I could do something productive. I could do something where at the end of it, I feel like I've achieved something. Now, obviously, playing a game well is an achievement too. I've just never been into that. And you know, I consider that in a sense, I've been fairly diverse in many of the kinds of things I've done, but there's certain kinds of things like that that I've sort of just not really probed. And perhaps that gives me more time to do other things that I'm more uniquely interested in. Or perhaps it's just a way that I've been, you know, unaware of things that I should be aware of. Paul is commenting, strange that as a university professor, you're not that interested in education. Your enthusiasm for these live streams says otherwise. Let me tell you something about my life as a professor. I mean, I would say that the sort of, I didn't mind giving, you know, I guess I didn't mind giving lectures and things, but I just sort of thought it was kind of a little bit of a waste of time. What I did like was, you know, occasionally interacting with individual students. And the thing that I found that was a tremendous shocker to me was, so I was a professor in a couple of places, but and one of them was the University of Illinois, where that was my sort of last port of call. I was a professor of physics, mathematics, and computer science. And I went there to start a research center for the kind of science that I was interested in and have remained interested in. And that's a quite different story about my experiences with that. But anyway, the sort of my favorite class that was my last stop in being a professor was I taught a physics for non-scientists class that I thought would be fun, and it was in some ways kind of well, I think I gave good lectures, and people from the town started showing up and sitting in the back, and so that was a good sign, so to speak. On the other hand, I think I just had no conception of things like homework and so on, because I never did that stuff. And you know, it turns out, at least in those days, when you became a professor, nobody like said, oh, by the way, this is how that works, and this is how TAs work and grades work and so on. I had no idea. So I do remember sort of a classic of bad professoring or something was, you know, I kind of had this idea that, you know, the thing that was interesting to do was to get people to learn to think. And so I kind of had this homework. I remember the very first question on the first homework was, estimate the number of ears of corn in a typical cornfield. And this question went over like an absolute lead balloon, because it's like, Professor, you didn't talk about that in class. It's like, well, look, you know elementary math, there are cornfields right around us here. Just see what you can figure out and, you know, explain how you figured it out. It's like, but that's not the kind of thing you do in a class like this. And it's like, okay, well, you know, that was what I thought was interesting. But you know, I found the few times that you know, I did office hours and things, and very few students would show up. Occasionally they would show up, and you know, the conversation was pretty much always the same. It's me saying, well, so what's the big picture story? You know, what are you studying? What do you want to do when you're grown up, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, I had some very interesting conversations with a bunch of students, and they were like, wow, we didn't have those conversations with anybody else. In fact, I've heard from a few of those people decades later, in some cases saying, oh, you actually gave us some really good advice that we took and it worked out great. And it's like, great, you know, I guess that's not what professors do. And I guess I had sort of an advantage because I probably knew more about the world at large than your average professor does. And so it wasn't like, okay, you should, you know, the only career advice is to become a professor type thing. But I found that kind of, you know, that aspect I found interesting. I you know, didn't do as much of it as I might have done. But yes, I think the somehow I felt like the thing that I really wanted to do was to sort of push forward with research rather than explain to people things I already knew. I've later learnt that that explaining process has a richness to it that I didn't really appreciate when I was younger. It's so let's see. People commenting here apparently about brainstorming and walking and why that's a good idea. Yeah, you know, I myself am very bad at thinking in a vacuum, so to speak. I mean, when I'm talking to people, I can be thinking. When I'm writing something, when I'm writing computational language, when I'm writing a program, all of those times I can think. When I'm just like, okay, you're doing nothing, just think about something, I don't find that particularly easy. You know, I always need some kind of concrete anchor to my thinking. I know other people work differently, and that's some, you know, for me, for example, when I've, you know, when I've been driving, for example, and I always, you know, I tend to be a drive myself if I can, rather than get driven kind of thing, for whatever reason. I think that, and it used to be the case long, long ago, before there were cell phones. It was like, oh my gosh, I've got this long drive that's so painful. What am I going to do? You know, maybe I'll listen to, you know, a book on tape or whatever else it is. And then, you know, even from the very early days, I mean, I remember in the late 1980s, you know, I had sort of early cell phones, and it's like, okay, you know, I'm just going to stack up a bunch of phone calls that I'm going to do. You know, I always have a list, a call while driving list. And when I know I'm going to be doing some longish drive, it'll be like, pick the next thing off the call while driving list. And I get to do a bunch of calls, where I feel like, you know, if I was just sitting at my desk and I'm like, you know, this is prime time. I usually refer to it as, you know, when I'm awake and I'm ready to do stuff and I can do kind of the hardest things I do, I'll never get to doing those phone calls. But when I'm driving from here to there for some other reason, it's like, that's the time to do this phone call that I otherwise would never have gotten around to. And I like to maintain this list of things to do then. Okay, there's a question from Philip here. Do I enjoy music and favorite composer or band? This is another area where I'm just pathetic, I have to say. Do I like listening to music? Sometimes, but I never do it while I work. Because I found that the only time, okay, so various kinds of music without vocals, it's got to be kind of, what can I say? It's got to be invigorating, but without words. And that sometimes I'll listen to when I'm, for example, trying to grind through very large amounts of email. I realized recently I haven't even been doing that. You know, sometimes when I feel like I need some invigoration, so to speak, when I've got 1,000 emails to grind through, and I'm going to look, you know, I've got to go through these and look at them. That's a time when I need some kind of audio stimulation, so to speak. But if I have things with words, I'm like totally distracted. I can't read words and listen to words. And I think I'm too much of a literalist in terms of, you know, if I'm listening to something with words, I try to actually pick out the words and see what does it say. Of course, if it's in some obscure enough language, I can't do that. But so I tend to have, for a while I had kind of a Celtic thing going of, you know, the sort of rousing things that didn't have words. But I've been pretty pathetic, I would say, in listening to these things. I mean, I you know, will occasionally, you know, I always said actually, I've not been very much into many kinds of music. I always used to say, and my children reminded me of this, that I said, I'll do stuff the kids want to do. So if they want to go to rock concerts, I'll go to rock concerts. I have 4 kids. Turns out none of them have wanted to go to rock concerts. The youngest one took me once to a Taylor Swift concert, but that's as close as I've gotten, and that was more interesting for its business aspects to me, perhaps, than other things. So I haven't had as much exposure, and I do have a terrible habit, which I should barely admit to, which is I have a terrible habit of whistling while I work, this is where I record often kind of these video work logs of things I do, and I always have to mute because, shocker if I ever recorded the I don't think completely tuneless kind of whistle while we work. I think it's kind of like, I feel like it's probably like what the songbirds are doing, so to speak. It's about that level of cognitive engagement. But anyway, so yes, I'm not really a big, that's not to say, at times I'll go to some, classical music event and so on, because it's something I'm going to or whatever else. And I always like it, but it's not something I seek out, and it's not a way that I typically choose to use time. And perhaps to my detriment. I mean, I'm always struck by the fact that, we talk about sort of the combinatorics of things, of, there is a discrete set of possibilities. And I'm always noticing this fact that, music is, you just pick up this small number of notes, and by putting them in different orders, you create all this amazing stuff. And it's stuff that communicates with us humans in a way that's different from the usual linguistic form of communication. And it's forms of communication that perhaps I'm not as attuned to as I might be, and other people are probably much more attuned to that. Parker asks, have I listened to music generated by AIs? Well, we have this project called Wolfram Tones, which we did back in 2007, which was kind of interesting to do. And it was kind of like, could we get something that was of any musical value by just purely sampling from the computational universe? You have simple programs, they produce complicated behavior, but because the program is simple, there's some kind of inner logic to what's being produced and some coherence to it. And can you kind of pluck things out of that, as a photographer might like pluck some image out of what they see in the natural world and have it be something that is of sort of musical value? And it's kind of fun. I would say that the thing that's been a surprise to me is running into composers who say it's a good source of inspiration. It's a thing that sort of will produce this kind of seed from which they can potentially build something. It's kind of like perhaps one might see some visual thing out in the world, and that becomes a seed for what is ultimately developed as a painting or something like that. I have to say, I've not been super impressed by the sort of AI music generation. I think the thing we did, which had the virtue of being very simple in its conception, was sort of interesting from the simplicity of its conception. I would say that I haven't been like, generating kind of sort of routine music type music. I see as being more of a thing that's kind of an AI source, and I'm not sure that I've had particular use cases for that myself. Somebody's commenting on liking the image of me at a Taylor Swift concert. One of the things that I have to say about the things that I choose to do, there are a lot of things that I do because it's like, look, I haven't done that before. That sounds interesting. I'll do that. I haven't done that before. And I'm quite I would say a lot of things where it's just like it gives me a little bit of extra perspective about the world, and I really like to do that at least once. Sometimes sometimes I do it once and it's like, oh my gosh, I'm never going to do this again. But at least I did it once and I learned something from that. And the same is true with traveling to different places and things like this that I found. It was it's cool. Doing different kinds of things at least once. Getting exposed to different parts of the world, talking to different kinds of people, and so on, at least once. I'm the kind of person who, if I'm on a commercial plane and, I'm sitting next to somebody, I'm the kind of person, super annoying perhaps to some, who will always start a conversation, so to speak. And that's a great, an interesting sampling as an example of, you learn all kinds of interesting things about all kinds of different areas that I usually would just never be exposed to. And I personally find that kind of thing really interesting. And that's sort of what ultimately, you never know when that piece of knowledge will come in handy. Another thing I tend to do, and not so much from people I run into there, but people I run into all over the place, I maintain kind of a list of experts I know or have met on different kinds of things. And once in a while, it's like, gosh, I really need to find somebody who knows about this, medical, business, organizational, whatever thing. Oh, let me look at that experts list. Oh yes, I remember I met that person N years ago, and it's a useful thing to be able to pick out. I sort of recommend that as a way to organize things, because I think it's it's a good way to remember things. And it's like, oh yes, I remember I ran into somebody who really knew a lot about that, and can I recover who that was? That usually it's like, gosh, you remembered that I knew about this, that's cool, type thing. Let's see. Questions about my involvement with the movie Arrival. That was a number of years ago now. That was it was interesting because we've been involved in a number of kind of Hollywoodish type things. One of the things that is a characteristics of that industry, unfortunately, is that the noise to signal ratio is very high. The number of projects where people are like, we're going to do this, it's going to be amazing, and then like flat, 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 and then nothing happens. That is, that is the 90% effect or more, at least in my experience of that industry. And so it's kind of like, is it really going to happen, or is it just going to waste time? We got involved in the Arrival movie very late in the story. They were about to start shooting it. They needed some visual backdrops and things. They reached out to us, and it was like, it became clear that we didn't really have visuals that would be an immediate fit. And so, it's like, send us the script, we'll see what we can do. And it's like, oh, the script is interesting. It's about extraterrestrial, contact and so on. It's a topic I'm interested in. So, and then it turned out my son, Christopher, who was then much younger than he is now, was somebody who was both a good programmer and not rolling their eyes at how can I spend time doing this. So he worked a bunch on actually generating visuals for that movie. And I think one of the things that was pretty cool was that because with Wolfram Language, you can generate all these visuals so quickly, he was able to actually interact with their, what's the name of that position? The person who deals with kind of what the set is going to be like. Kind of art director type person. You could just say, hey, we'd like something that looks like this. And Christopher could be like, okay, I can generate that. And half an hour later, there's actual pictures and things that they can put up around the, around the set and so on. And so that movie has the feature that it's one of the only movies where the code that you see being typed or whatever by the actors is actually code that, or you see on the screens, is actually the code that made the pictures that you see there. Because it really was the code that made the pictures, and they were actually on the screens, and so it could be photographed there. To me, it was interesting. Just visited the set for a couple of days, and it's always interesting to see what happens in movies, because it's in my life, I run a company. I've been running for 35 years. It's got a lot of streams of activity where there are people who've been doing that for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. There's a lot of kind of continuity of we've been working together a long time, we kind of know what's happening. Whereas movies have this feature that there's maybe 500 people involved. It's big movies, it's more than that. But they're all kind of coming in, and this movie, it's like people say, well, I'm contracted to be here this week, and then next week I'm not here, and somebody else is picking up something. It's an industry where it's managed to get to the point where there are many roles that are plug compatible enough that somebody can just come in for a week or two and do something useful. It's an interesting kind of factoring, because it's not at all the way that it would work for a company like ours. I mean, there's just a huge amount of sort of institutional knowledge that's necessary to plug into things. I mean, even and it's something in our particular company, we've been very vertically integrated for forever. And so, we have in-house graphic design, this, that, and the other, all these different functions that people will sometimes outsource to other organizations, where you do get more of, oh, I've got this graphic design thing that has to be done. It's done this week by this designer. And then in another 2 months, we'll have something else to be done. And a completely different person will pick that up and just sort of plug compatibly do it. For me, it's been much better to have in-house people doing these things, because they develop this kind of real knowledge of how the things we do work. Now, in order to make that happen, it has to be the case that you define kind of the buckets of what they do broadly enough that there's a decently continuous stream of work. It can't be the case that you have that graphic designer or something, and there's only, there's one thing to be done every 3 months, and for the rest of the time, they're just hanging out with nothing to do. You have to have a sort of broad enough remit for what the people are doing, that there is a more or less continuous stream of activities. And you have to have these sort of background projects sometimes for some of these groups that, if the foreground, high intensity project isn't there, well, they know what to do. There's a thing that we need done over the next few months or years. That is the background thing they do when the high intensity thing doesn't happen to be going on. Let's see. There's a question here from Bard about advice about time management and prioritizing for a first-time parent trying to juggle being present in a kid's life, but also recently starting a business. I don't know, I think for me, I would say that I didn't necessarily decode this at the beginning when my older kids were first around, but for me, it really has helped that I've worked at home for the last 30-something years. And so that means that I'm kind of sort of around. But I do think that in somehow the situation that, at some level, one doesn't want to be in is kind of the resenting, oh my gosh, I have to spend all this time with this kid and this and that and the other. And it's like, if you can be at the point where the time you spend is time you're really excited to be spending, that's a good thing. And if that means that, it's the situation where you're, as you get, well, it depends on the age of the kid, but as the kids get older, one of the things that I've certainly believed in is, my kids certainly know what I do for a living, so to speak. Have been, as involved in it as they might have been. One of them works at the company now, but they're certainly, and I'm another one. I'm often getting advice about things from the other ones, but it's the fact that there's sort of a kind of, the kids kind of know what the story is, and when there's some thing that makes one really busy, they kind of know what it is, and it's not just some mysterious thing that could be just, oh, I'm fed up with dealing with the kid. It's like, look, they're busy because there's some great product announcement that's happening or some such other thing. And it's like, my kids have had many opinions over the course of years about the things that we should be doing at the company and so on, and things I'm doing. Sometimes they're right, sometimes they're wrong, but it's educational for them. It's really, to me, it helps me feel like, I appreciate it when my kids actually seem to care about things that I do. And so, you don't get to that point without sharing some of that with them, so to speak. And so I think that's a worthwhile thing. And some of my kids have been, actually, particularly in the past when I've kind of traveled around the world, some of my kids have come with me and, are in all kinds of business meetings. It's always fun when, but in past years, particularly when my two middle kids particularly were somewhat younger, they'd be in some long drawn out business meeting in some part of the world. And after the meeting, they would say, okay, you did the wrong thing at this place. Were you listening to what the person actually said? This is what they said. and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You should pay more attention type thing. So that's always interesting and perhaps educational for the kids too, and no doubt educational for the kids. But I think, I mean, the thing that I tend to believe is that any situation where you are doing things that you kind of resent doing, it's a bad situation. And so the extent to which you can organize things so you're not in that situation, it's a good thing. And when it's a question of I've tended to take the point of view, okay, so I've sort of, taken dinner time more or less off. Well, unless the people I'm eating dinner with have their computers open too. And that's been a good sort of anchor for me of a, time to make sure one interacts with, kids and spouse and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a thing that, I do tend to think that a certain degree of predictability like that is helpful for all concerned. But anyway, those are a few 2 cents worth. Let's see. Diana is asking, how did you know you wanted to have children, and did they contribute in any way towards your learning in your field and general lifelong learning? Absolutely. My children are, I have learned so much from them, and even from sort of in so many ways, I've learned a lot from them. I mean, I kind of always found children interesting, partly because I kind of like thinking about things from first principles, and that's something where, that's what children do, so to speak, because they don't know the big stack of things that everybody is supposed to know. And so they do tend to think about things from first principles, and that makes them fun to talk to. I also find that many kids have this idea that sort of anything is possible, and it often is for them. At least one hopes it is. And that has a certain degree of it. It's kind of fun to talk to people where sort of anything is possible, so to speak, rather than like, oh yeah, I've tried that, I've tried this. It's like, oh, it's never going to work. It's just, it's all downhill from here type thing. I think that I always used to tell my wife that I couldn't deal with children under the age of 10. That turned out not to be quite correct. But definitely it got, I would say it got better, and I had more fun, and probably they had more fun as they got a bit older, because it's like, my children have been interested in all kinds of different things, and I've learned all kinds of things from that. I think one doesn't want to crowd one's children's interests, and so to speak, and just, oh, you're interested in that, well, let me do that too, type thing. But on the other hand, I've certainly learned a lot from sort of seeing the kind of runoff from their interests. I think that it's always, I have found for a long time, they're just things I can learn from my children, and they maybe I'm fortunate enough to have sort of children who, think well and things like this, but, they have been good sources of advice since they were pretty young, and probably getting even better so. The other thing that I've noticed is, my children are sort of obviously genetically related to me, and it is amusing to see things that were traits of mine play out in my children. Traits of mine that I could imagine must have been very annoying to people, but then they play out in my children. And it's like, in fact, a quote that my oldest son was fond of giving me was a quote from me, which is, people get the children they deserve. He was fond of that particular quote as kind of both positive and negatively, so to speak. But it is interesting to me sometimes to see, things where my children will say up and down, oh, we're not doing this like you've done it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it turns out they're doing something very similar to something that I've done. And not necessarily in terms of content, but in terms of the sort of way they lead their lives and so on. And it's just very interesting to see that play out in a different person, so to speak, and sort of from the outside. I think, a number of things I've done. I mean, I have to say the one part of the motivation to build Wolf Alpha was actually due to my then, oh, must have been 2006. So let's see, we were 8. My younger son, Christopher, who was learning kind of Wolfram language programming and was like, why can't you just type ordinary English to this thing? You know, why doesn't that work? And it's like, oh, I explained, oh, it's really hard, blah, blah, blah. You know, people have been trying to do that for a long time, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And he was like, look, how hard can it possibly be? You know, how many different ways are there to say this or that thing? And so he kind of led me a little bit down the kind of product development type thing. And it's like, you know, I had other reasons to be interested in kind of the Wolfram Alpha idea and so on. And it's like, okay, I guess you're right. And that was one important contribution to kind of the seed of a product. Actually, you know, other things we've done are things that were kind of conceptualized by things, you know, my kids suggested. So it's you know, I'm grateful for that. You know, the only question is that has the trade gone both ways? Have they done things that I've suggested to them? I'm not sure whether that trade has actually. I've certainly suggested plenty of things. You know, I think the trick is not to suggest too much, but that's a thing there. But I think for me, I mean, my kids are, you know, I consider them a tremendous and very fulfilling investment, so to speak, of time and lots of other things. And you know, big win. I mean, it's at least as far as I'm concerned. Okay, Bard is asking, how do you manage at-home office hours and with the kids? You know, okay, I have to admit that you know, I did kind of get sort of my office built out, and you know, I had this sort of fairly elaborate kind of sort of outside kind of hallway, and then the office and so on, and there's sort of 2 sets of doors, and that pretty much kills any possible noise. I have to say that for me, it was at the point where, like, you know, for me, if the kids sort of come in and you know, if I'm in the middle of something, and I usually am, that, you know, doesn't work if I'm actually in the middle of things. But for me, it's like if the kids are coming in, that's actually a win as far as I'm concerned. Great, nice to see them type thing. But I can certainly see, you know, you have to have that kind of sort of audio and expectation thing. I think the point is, by the time my kids were of any reasonable age, they were pretty aware of the fact that, you know, kind of one works for a living, and there's like one is really doing stuff and so on. And I just found this picture, actually, I happened to include it in the blog post of 2 of my kids when sort of, I don't remember the circumstances at all, but they're kind of sitting at my desk, also doing things as I'm not in that picture paying attention to anything, but I might have been working on stuff. I haven't mostly, the theory of kid hangs out in office while I do work, that I haven't really done. And I don't think that's maybe in some special situations I did that, but that's not generally been a thing that I've thought works very well, because it's kind of like, then you're in this resentment mode where, look, I'm trying to pay attention, you know, I don't want to talk to you about this thing, and that's sort of not the situation you want to be in. Okay, the universe is saying, on topic of kids, I'm currently eating a box of Cheerios with my 2 kiddos while watching this. Very good. Let's see, maybe one more thing, and then I should probably wrap up for the day. So, number of things here I could respond to. There's one here. Maybe those are Hindi characters. I'm not sure, but anyway, asking, what do I think about criticism of remote work by Elon Musk? About, I don't know what Elon has specifically said about that, other than it's like you should come back to the office. Apparently about innovation not working as well in a distributed remote manner. I think it really depends on what an organization is used to. You know, my company has been geo-distributed for more than 30 years, and it's my style of doing things. You know, I think we get a pretty good grade of, you know, A plus type grade for innovation over that period of time, while the company has been very geo-distributed. So I think we've managed to have a culture where it's possible to have innovation happen without people being physically in the same place. I don't know. I mean, I'm sort of so used to doing things remotely that I don't know the dynamics that sort of happen more locally and how they differ. I mean, I know at our summer school, for example, apart from the last 2 years, we've had that in person for 20 years. And yeah, there's a certain, for me, there's a certain additional kind of, a certain additional level of communication perhaps that happens. There's also, to my mind, a certain degree of inefficiency there. You know, perhaps it's because I'm so unused to doing things in person that, you know, like when I go visit our company main office or something like that, it's like, it's great. I like seeing all the people who are there, not that there are too many people, we have lovely office space and there are too many people who are not using it, but that's a different story right now. But in any case, you know, it's fun to see the people and it's fun to have that kind of social interaction, but I don't think, you know, I'm trying to think, you know, if I think about sort of ideas I've had with people, I don't think there is any noticeable difference. In fact, it might even be a negative to the interaction, you know, in person, one-on-one, rather than, you know, remotely, even by phone, by, you know, not video necessarily, because I often don't do that. You know, it's the once one has, you know, I don't, at least in my experience, the ability to innovate can happen when you have the right kind of form of interaction, and it isn't to do with people being in the same room. Now, clearly, if you're making physical things like cars or spacecraft, you know, there is a certain be there type character to it. I mean, it's like, you know, you know, the SpaceX factory, which I happen to have seen, you know, has lots of interesting stuff in it. And I'm sure if you're being motivated and interested in things about spacecraft, you know, wandering through the factory is a good thing to do. If you wander around our company, you'll see a bunch of people in offices and cubicles and open space and whatever, and you'll see some, you know, a few server rooms and things. And it's like, there's nothing to see here. There's no, you know, actually at our company, we do have some tourist attractions, which are physically interesting, mostly historical and scientific kinds of artifacts. But those are perhaps in some cases are conversation pieces. But I would say that we're not in a business where there's inspiration to be got from seeing the physical stuff that, for example, we're making. So perhaps we're in a somewhat different situation in that regard. All right, I think that's probably all I have time for here today, although there are lots of lovely questions here, and I look forward to being able to address some more of these another time. But I think I have to go back to my day job here and I'll wrap up for now. So thanks, and